Are you lost, Grandpa? The visitor's center is back that way. This is a restricted flight line, not a retirement home patio. The voice was sharp, laced with the kind of arrogant confidence that only youth and a freshly pressed uniform can bestow. Lieutenant Caden Hayes, with his perfectly coiffed hair and aviator sunglasses perched on his nose, stood with his arms crossed, looking down at the old man. The man in question, Samuel Finch, didn't even turn. He was dressed in a simple, worn flannel shirt and faded jeans, his hands tucked into his pockets. He was staring at the machine parked on the tarmac, an AH-64 Apache, its composite blades drooping slightly in the afternoon sun. It looked like a dormant predator, all sharp angles and deadly purpose. Samuel's eyes, clear and startlingly blue in a face etched with the deep lines of nearly 9 decades, traced the contours of the helicopter's fuselage. He saw not just a machine, but a lineage, a promise fulfilled. He'd seen the blueprints for its soul on crumpled napkins in smoky backrooms long before a single rivet had been set. Hayes took a step closer, his polished boots crunching on the gravel. The lack of an immediate, fearful response from the old man irritated him. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Are you deaf?" He gestured impatiently with a thumb over his shoulder. "This is government property and you're not authorized. Now move along before I have to call security." Samuel finally turned his head slowly, his gaze shifting from the helicopter to the young lieutenant. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, just a calm, patient assessment that seemed to peel back the layers of Hayes's bluster. "She's a fine piece of engineering," Samuel said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The T-700 engines, much more reliable than the old Lycomings, less prone to compressor stalls in a high G turn." The technical specificity of the comment caught Hayes off guard. He frowned. "Yeah, well, you wouldn't know anything about that. This is a billion-dollar weapons system, not a vintage car you can reminisce about." He puffed out his chest. "I fly this fine piece of engineering, and I'm telling you to leave." A young sergeant working on the tail rotor of a nearby Black Hawk, Ava Rostova, paused, her wrench hovering over a bolt. She'd heard the lieutenant's condescending tone, and now she watched the interaction. She saw the old man's posture. He wasn't stooped with age, he was settled, rooted to the spot like an ancient oak. There was an economy of motion to him that spoke not of frailty, but of profound self-control. She saw his hands as he pulled one from his pocket to shield his eyes from the sun. They were gnarled with arthritis, the skin thin and spotted, but the fingers were long and sure. They looked like a pilot's hands. The confrontation continued to escalate. Lieutenant Hayes, accustomed to immediate obedience, was growing visibly frustrated by the old man's quiet defiance. "Look, I don't have time for this. We're prepping for a capabilities demonstration for the Secretary of the Air Force. The last thing I need is some civilian wandering into a prop wash." He gestured dismissively at the Apache. "You have no idea what it takes to get behind the controls of a bird like this. The reflexes, the cognitive load, the physical stamina. It's a young man's game." Samuel offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It always has been," he agreed softly, his eyes drifting back to the cockpit canopy. He could almost feel the phantom weight of the helmet, the familiar vibration of the rotor system resonating up through the seat and into his bones. Hayes misinterpreted the quiet agreement as submission. "Exactly. So why don't you do us all a favor and go find a bench somewhere? Tell your war stories to the pigeons." He started to turn away, considering the matter closed. But Samuel spoke again, his voice carrying a new weight that made Hayes pause. "The stories aren't for the pigeons," he said, his gaze distant. "They're for the ones who didn't come back to tell their own." The statement hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. It wasn't a rebuke. It was a simple, profound truth. Across the tarmac, Sergeant Rostova felt a chill. The lieutenant's casual cruelty was grating, but the old man's response, It was different. It wasn't the kind of thing you just say. It was the kind of thing you earn the right to say. She put her wrench down and started walking slowly toward them, keeping a professional distance but positioning herself to intervene if necessary. She noticed a faint, faded tattoo on the old man's forearm, mostly obscured by his sleeve. It was a winged dagger entwined with a serpent, an old, unofficial unit insignia she'd only ever seen in history books, from a unit that wasn't supposed to exist. Hayes, however, was impervious to the nuance. He just saw an old man trying to get the last word. "Oh, here we go. Every old-timer's got a story. We'll save it. This is the new army, Grandpa. We're more interested in performance metrics and network-centric warfare than we are in your dusty memories." He took another step toward Samuel, invading his personal space. "Final warning. Leave. Now." Samuel's placid expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened, the clear blue deepening to the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake. He held the lieutenant's gaze, and for the first time, Hayes felt a flicker of uncertainty. It was like looking into a deep well and not being able to see the bottom. The old man wasn't looking at him, he was looking through him, and what he saw seemed to be of little consequence. This silent, unyielding dignity was more infuriating to Hayes than any argument. He felt his authority being subtly undermined, not by a challenge, but by a complete lack of acknowledgement that he had any authority to begin with. The smell of burnt kerosene from a taxiing F-16 hit the air, sharp and familiar. For Samuel, it was a key turning a lock in the deepest part of his memory. The world of bright sun and polished concrete dissolved, replaced by the humid, claustrophobic darkness of a jungle canopy. The rhythmic whump-whump-whump of rotor blades was no longer the distant sound of a modern bass, but the immediate, life-sustaining heartbeat of his own ship, a Huey cobra skimming the treetops. He wasn't an old man in a flannel shirt, he was Spectre, a 20-something pilot with ice in his veins, his hands steady on the cyclic and collective. Below him, green tracers reached up like grasping fingers, stitching lines of deadly light through the gloom. His co-pilot, a kid named Jimmy, with a picture of his high school sweetheart taped to the dashboard, was shouting coordinates over the intercom. "Hot LZ, Spectre, they're pinned down. Taking heavy fire from the tree line, 9 o'clock. Samuel didn't need the coordinates. He could feel the battle, taste the metallic tang of fear and cordite in the air. He banked the Cobra hard, the G-force pressing him into his seat. The helicopter responded instantly, a living extension of his will. His thumb found the trigger for the 2.75-inch rockets. He saw the muzzle flashes, tiny sparks of death in the dense green. He didn't aim at them. He aimed at where they would be. A breath held, a silent calculation of speed, trajectory, and wind. He squeezed the trigger. A ripple of fire erupted from the pods under his stub wings. The rockets screamed into the jungle, and a moment later, the tree line bloomed with orange and black. The enemy fire ceased. "Good effect on target, Spectre. They're breaking! The grunts are popping smoke!" Jimmy's voice was a mix of awe and relief. Samuel didn't celebrate. He was already scanning for the next threat, his mind a whirlwind of checklists and tactical possibilities. He brought the Cobra around, laying down a curtain of suppressing fire from the chin-mounted minigun as the medevac chopper descended toward the green smoke. He was their guardian angel, a phantom of vengeance in a machine of war. The memory was so real he could feel the buck of the gun, the sweat trickling down his spine. He remembered the faces of the young soldiers he'd pulled out of impossible situations, and the faces of those he hadn't. The weight of it all settled back on him, a familiar burden he'd carried for more than 60 years. He blinked, and the jungle was gone. The tracers were gone. Jimmy was gone. He was just an old man again, standing on a peaceful tarmac, with a young, arrogant lieutenant's face just inches from his own. Lieutenant Hayes saw the old man's eyes glaze over for a second and mistook it for senility. "See? You're not even all there. It's time to go." He reached out and placed a firm, condescending hand on Samuel's shoulder, intending to physically steer him away from the helicopter. The moment his fingers made contact, something shifted. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible, yet change. Samuel didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even breathe. But a current of energy seemed to pass through his frail-looking frame. His back straightened by a fraction of an inch. His shoulders, which had been slightly rounded with age, squared up. The placid look in his eyes vanished, replaced by a focus so intense it was like the lens of a camera snapping into sharp relief. Hayes felt it instantly. The shoulder under his hand felt not like brittle bone, but like a knot of solid, unyielding oak. He felt the muscles tense not in aggression, but in a state of absolute readiness. He tried to push, to guide the old man, but it was like trying to move a statue bolted to the foundation of the earth. He might as well have been pushing against the hangar wall. He instinctively tried to pull his hand back, but for a split second he felt as if he couldn't. It wasn't that the old man was holding him. It was that the sheer force of the man's presence had paralyzed his own arm. Sergeant Rostova saw the entire exchange. She saw the lieutenant's arrogant gesture, and she saw the terrifying stillness that came over the old man. She saw the flicker of shock, then fear in Hayes's eyes. Her blood ran cold. That was not the reaction of a confused senior citizen. That was the coiled spring stillness of a man who had lived his entire life at the razor's edge of violence, a man for whom a stranger's touch was a potential threat to be instantly assessed and neutralized. Her hand went to her radio, but she paused. This wasn't a job for the MPs. This was something else. Her mind raced back to the tattoo, the winged dagger. 161st Aviation Company, the Spectres, a unit that flew top-secret missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the dead of night. Legends, ghosts, most of their records were still classified. Pulling out her phone, she bypassed the chain of command. She had the base commander's direct cell number, a privilege earned through her reputation as the sharpest NCO in the maintenance battalion. She typed a quick, urgent text. "Sir, you need to get to Hangar 4, Flight Line Alpha. Unidentified civilian male, approx. 85, 90 years old, in a confrontation with Lieutenant Hayes. Sir, I think I know who he is. Look for a Spectre tattoo on his forearm. Please hurry." She hit send, her heart pounding. Hayes, finally managing to snatch his hand back, took an involuntary step away. His face was pale. The swagger was gone, replaced by a confused apprehension. "What the hell?" he stammered. Samuel didn't answer. He simply lowered his head slightly, as if containing a power he had no desire to unleash. The brief, intense connection had left an echo in the air, a silent testament to a truth the young lieutenant was utterly unprepared to comprehend. The distant whine of an approaching vehicle grew rapidly into the roar of a command Humvee. It screeched to a halt a few yards away, and the passenger door flew open. Out stepped a man whose presence immediately eclipsed Lieutenant Hayes's manufactured authority. Colonel Jennings, the base commander, was a tall man with a weathered face and the unmistakable bearing of a career officer who had spent more time in the field than behind a desk. He didn't even glance at Hayes. His eyes were locked on Samuel. Jennings moved with a purpose that scattered the small crowd of onlookers. He strode directly toward the old man, his expression a mixture of disbelief, urgency, and profound respect. Sergeant Rostova let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The colonel stopped 3 feet in front of Samuel. He took in the faded flannel shirt, the worn jeans, and the clear, steady eyes that had seen a universe of things Jennings could only read about in classified reports. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave of confusion through every junior airman and officer watching, Colonel Jennings snapped to the most rigid, perfect salute of his life. His arm was ramrod straight, his hand trembling ever so slightly with the force of his emotion. "Mr. Finch," Jennings said, his voice thick with reverence. "It's an honor, sir. A profound honor. We weren't aware you were on base today." Samuel slowly raised his eyes to meet the colonel's. A flicker of recognition, of shared understanding, passed between them. He gave a slow, almost weary nod. "Colonel?" he acknowledged simply. Lieutenant Hayes stood frozen, his mouth agape. His entire world had just been turned upside down. The base commander was saluting. This old man? This grandpa he had just threatened to have thrown off the flight line? It made no sense. He looked from the colonel to Samuel and back again, his mind struggling to process the scene. "Sir?" Hayes finally managed to choke out, his voice a squeak. "Sir, I don't understand. This man was in a restricted area. He refused to—" Jennings cut him off without even looking at him. He lowered his salute, but kept his eyes fixed on Samuel. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, a cold, hard edge of fury now underpinning his words. "Close your mouth and stand by. You're about to receive an education." He turned his full attention back to Samuel. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I apologize for the conduct of my officer. He is young, and he is ignorant." He then turned his head just enough to pin Hayes with a glare that could strip paint. "And he is about to become profoundly less so." The silence on the tarmac was now absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the bass. Everyone was staring, trying to comprehend the incredible deference being shown to this unassuming old man. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly annihilated. Colonel Jennings took a half step back, as if to give Samuel space, but his posture remained one of deep respect. He turned his body slightly, addressing not just the mortified Lieutenant Hayes, but the entire assembled group of onlookers. "Lieutenant," he began, his voice ringing with authority and shame. "You asked this man to save his war stories. You have no idea how privileged you would be to hear even a single one of them. You stand there in your flight suit so proud of the machine you fly." He gestured to the Apache. "You think you're at the cutting edge. What you don't realize is that you're standing in the presence of the man who helped write the book on everything you do." A murmur went through the crowd. Hayes's face had gone from pale to ashen. "This," the colonel announced, his voice rising, "is Samuel Finch. To most of the world, that name means nothing. But in certain circles, in the quiet, dusty archives of Army aviation and in the halls of the Pentagon, that name is spoken with the same reverence we reserve for pioneers and legends. You see that helicopter?" He pointed again at the Apache. Long before the first AH-64 rolled off the assembly line, Mr. Finch was flying its spiritual predecessor, a modified Bell Cobra, stripped of all markings, flying classified night missions deep in enemy territory. He and a handful of others invented modern attack helicopter doctrine on the fly, in the dark, under fire. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. His call sign was Spectre. He was the original Spectre. The 161st Aviation Company was his home. They didn't officially exist. Their missions were deniable. Their casualty rates were astronomical. They were ghosts. Jennings took a step toward Hayes, his eyes blazing. "You talked about reflexes and cognitive load. This man flew in near-total darkness, navigating by starlight and dead reckoning, engaging targets his wingman would mark with infrared, all while avoiding enemy patrols and anti-aircraft fire. He did it with analog gauges and a grease pencil. You have a helmet-mounted display, GPS, and a dozen redundant systems. He had his skill, his gut, and the man flying next to him. He did more with less than you could possibly imagine." The colonel turned back to Samuel. He was shot down twice, evaded capture both times. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. 3 silver stars, and a distinguished flying cross. You won't find them on his record, of course. The missions were too secret. The medals were awarded in a closed room by a general who shook his hand and told him he could never speak of it. The revelation washed over the crowd. Sergeant Rostova felt a surge of vindication. Lieutenant Hayes looked like he was going to be physically sick. He stared at Samuel, at the man he'd called Grandpa, and saw him for the first time, a living monument to a history he'd never known. "So, no, Lieutenant," Jennings finished, his voice dropping again. "He is not lost. He is not confused. He is standing here looking at a machine he helped dream into existence. He has more right to be on this tarmac than any of us. He earned this ground." Just then, a frantic-looking major ran up to Colonel Jennings, his face flushed. "Sir, we have a problem. A big one?" Jennings held up a hand, his focus still on the situation with Samuel. But the major persisted. "Colonel, it's Captain Davis. The demo pilot for the SecAF visit. He just collapsed. The medics think it's a burst appendix. He's on his way to the hospital. The secretary is arriving in 30 minutes, and the demonstration is the main event. We have no backup pilot cleared for this specific low-altitude flight profile." The news hung in the air, a fresh crisis layered onto the personal drama. Canceling the demonstration for the Secretary of the Air Force was not an option. It would be a catastrophic embarrassment for the base and for Jennings personally. Panic began to set in among the ground crew. Hayes, despite his humiliation, felt a flicker of hope. This was his chance. "Sir, I can do it," he said, stepping forward. "I know the profile. I've flown it in the sim." Jennings gave him a withering look. "You're not cleared for it, Lieutenant. And frankly, after your performance today, I wouldn't trust you to fly a desk." The insult was brutal and public. Hayes flinched as if struck. The colonel paced for a moment, running a hand over his face. The situation was impossible. He looked at the Apache, then at the empty sky where the secretary's transport would soon appear. Then his eyes fell on Samuel Finch. An idea, insane and brilliant, sparked in his mind. It was a wild gamble, a flagrant violation of 100 regulations. But he was looking at a legend. Legends didn't follow the same rules. He walked back over to Samuel, his expression now one of desperate appeal. "Sir, Mr. Finch," he began, his voice hesitant. "I know this is unorthodox, and I have no right to ask, but I'm in a bind." Samuel just watched him, his calm, blue eyes, waiting. "That flight profile," Jennings continued, speaking faster now. "It's not just a standard demonstration. It's based on early nap-of-the-earth techniques. Maneuvers designed to show the absolute maximum agility of the airframe. The kind of flying nobody does anymore because the risk assessments are too high. It's your kind of flying, sir." He took a deep breath. "The pilot is down. The secretary is on his way. I need a pilot who can fly that bird like it's an extension of his own body." He looked Samuel directly in the eye, the crazy, impossible question hanging between them. "Sir, can you still fly her?" A long silence stretched out. The wind whispered across the tarmac. Samuel looked from the colonel's desperate face to the sleek, deadly shape of the Apache. A slow smile touched the corners of his lips, the first real expression anyone had seen from him all day. It was a smile that held decades of memories, of danger and triumph. "The stick is the same," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The pedals are the same, the sky is the same." He took a step toward the helicopter. "Get me a helmet." The entire flight line galvanized into a state of controlled chaos. Colonel Jennings barked orders, his decision, however insane, now the absolute law of the base. "Get this man a flight suit and a helmet. Now! I want a full pre-flight check done 5 minutes ago. Rostova, you're his crew chief. You answer to him and only him. Get it done." Sergeant Rostova didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted toward the ready room, a team of seasoned mechanics following her. They returned in minutes with a flight suit, boots, and a modern HGU 56 HAL-P helmet. As Samuel began to change, shedding his civilian clothes, a transformation occurred. With each piece of gear he put on, the years seemed to melt away. The flannel shirt came off, revealing a torso that was lean and wiry, not frail. The flight suit, though a bit loose, gave him a renewed sense of purpose. But the real change happened when they handed him the helmet. He took it in his gnarled hands, feeling its weight, its balance. His movements became fluid, efficient. He ran his fingers over the integrated optics, a world away from the simple visor of his old brain bucket. Lieutenant Hayes stood by, a ghost at the proceedings, watching in stunned silence. He watched as Samuel approached the Apache, not with the hesitant steps of an old man, but with the familiar rolling gait of a pilot who was coming home. He moved around the aircraft, his hands touching the fuselage, tapping the rotor blades, his eyes conducting a pre-flight inspection from pure ingrained memory. He didn't need a checklist. He was the checklist. Rostova stood by the cockpit, ready to assist him. "Sir, the startup sequence is on the MFD. I can walk you through it." Samuel looked up at her from the base of the boarding ladder. "Daughter," he said gently, "I was helping the engineers design the logic for these systems when your parents were in grade school. I'll be fine." He climbed into the front seat, the gunner's position, then expertly swung himself into the pilot's seat in the rear. It was a surprisingly agile move. Once inside, his hands flew across the console. There was no hesitation. His fingers, which had seemed stiff with age just moments before, now danced across the buttons and switches with an intimate familiarity. He flipped a series of switches, and the instrument panels flickered to life, bathing the cockpit in a soft, green glow. "APU start," he murmured, his voice coming over the ground crew's headsets calm and clear. The auxiliary power unit whined to life. "Canopy closing?" The canopy lowered with a hiss, sealing him inside. A moment later, the powerful turbines began to spool up, the sound building from a high-pitched whine to a deafening roar. The massive four-bladed rotor began to turn, slowly at first, then faster and faster until it was a transparent, shimmering disk above the aircraft. Through the canopy, they could see him, a silhouette against the glowing screens. He gave a crisp thumbs up. Colonel Jennings stood on the flight line, his arms crossed, a knot of anxiety and exhilaration in his stomach. He had just staked his entire career on a ghost. The Apache lifted off the ground, not jumping into the air like the younger pilots tended to do, but rising smoothly, gracefully as if levitating. It hovered at 10 feet for a perfect 30 seconds, as steady as if it were parked on solid glass. Then it dipped its nose and accelerated forward with a speed that stole the breath. It didn't just fly, it attacked the air. Samuel flew the demonstration profile with a terrifying precision and artistry that left everyone speechless. He performed a low-level, high-speed pass that was so low, the rotor wash kicked up a cloud of dust from the tarmac. He pulled the Apache into a wingover, a climbing turn that transitioned into a dive, a maneuver that looked more like something from a fighter jet. He did things they had only read about in training manuals, things that were theoretically possible but never attempted. He made the 2-ton attack helicopter dance. It pirouetted, it slid sideways, it even seemed to fly backward at one point. It was a display of pure, instinctual flying, a master artist at work with his chosen instrument. The entire base had stopped to watch, every face turned to the sky in silent, collective awe. The Secretary of the Air Force's plane was just entering its final approach, and its occupants had a front-row seat to the most incredible display of aerial skill they would ever witness. The Apache completed its final maneuver, a breathtaking pedal turn at speed, and then transitioned seamlessly into a landing approach. It didn't come in hot and fast. It slowed, descended, and settled onto the tarmac with a gentleness that defied its size and power. The landing was so soft, the landing gear barely seemed to compress. For a moment after the engines began to spool down, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the wind and the slow, rhythmic sweep of the decelerating rotor blades. Then, the silence was shattered. A wave of spontaneous, thunderous applause erupted from every corner of the flight line. It came from the ground crew, the other pilots, the security forces, and even from the windows of the command building. It was a raw, visceral tribute to the mastery they had just witnessed. Inside the cockpit, Samuel took a long, deep breath. He powered down the final systems, and the cockpit fell silent. He looked out at the crowd, not with pride, but with a quiet sense of satisfaction. It felt good to stretch his wings again. The canopy hissed open. As he began to climb out, Sergeant Rostova was the first one at the ladder, her hand extended to help. He took it, and she felt the steady strength in his grip. When he was on the ground, Colonel Jennings was the first to reach him. He didn't say a word. He simply extended his hand. Samuel shook it firmly. The gesture said everything. Then a figure pushed through the crowd. It was Lieutenant Hayes. His face was a wreck of conflicting emotions: shame, awe, regret. He stopped in front of Samuel, his posture no longer arrogant but hunched and broken. He looked the old man in the eye, and his own eyes were wet. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking. "Sir, there are no words. What I said to you, how I treated you, it was inexcusable. I was arrogant. I was disrespectful, and I was wrong. So profoundly wrong." He struggled to compose himself. "That was the greatest display of flying I have ever seen. You are everything I ever hoped to be as a pilot. I'm so sorry, sir. I apologize." He stood there, braced for a tirade, a dismissal, anything. But Samuel just looked at him with those calm, steady eyes. He saw not an arrogant officer, but a young, humbled man who had just learned one of life's hardest lessons. Samuel reached out and placed his gnarled hand on the young lieutenant's shoulder, the same shoulder Hayes had grabbed just an hour before. This time, the touch was not a threat, but a benediction. "Son," Samuel said, his voice gentle but firm, "arrogance is a shield for fear. Fear that you're not good enough, fear that you'll be found out." He squeezed the shoulder lightly. "Today, you learned that this uniform doesn't make you a warrior, and these wings don't make you a pilot. They're just symbols. The honor, the skill, that has to come from in here." He tapped his own chest. "Don't be afraid of what you don't know. Be ready to learn from it, especially from the things that look old and worn out. Sometimes that's where the most important lessons are kept." He gave Hayes a final brief smile. "You'll be a good pilot, Lieutenant. Today you started becoming a good man." Hayes could only nod, tears now openly streaming down his face. The events of that afternoon became the stuff of legend at that base. They called it the Day of the Spectre. Lieutenant Hayes was never the same. The arrogant shell was gone, replaced by a quiet, humble professionalism. He became known for seeking out the oldest mechanics, the most grizzled NCOs, listening to their stories and absorbing their wisdom. He became one of the best pilots on the base, not because of his ego, but because he finally understood that true skill was built on a foundation of humility. Samuel Finch left as quietly as he had arrived. He had no interest in the accolades or the attention from the secretary's office. He had just wanted to see the new birds, to feel that connection one last time. He had reminded them all of a vital truth, that the sleek, powerful machines of today were forged in the crucible of yesterday's sacrifices. He was a living link to that past, a reminder that behind every technological advancement are the human beings who bled and sweat to make it possible. What happened on that flight line was more than just the vindication of one man. It was a powerful lesson for a new generation. It was a reminder not to judge a book by its cover, not to mistake age for weakness, and never, ever to underestimate the quiet old man in the faded flannel shirt. He might just be a giant resting in the shade. Our world is full of these hidden heroes, men and women who carry the weight of incredible history within them, their stories hidden behind quiet eyes and wrinkled smiles. They don't ask for recognition. They don't wear their heroism on their sleeves, but they are the pillars upon which our present is built. The next time you see an elderly veteran, take a moment. Look past the stooped shoulders and the slow gait and try to see the person who stood tall when it mattered most. Offer them your respect. You may just be in the presence of a legend. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue to honor these incredible individuals.